Chapter 3. The Eligibility for the Quest. The mist descended over the cliffs of the mountains. Embracing the treetops, it entered the cave. The sun had not yet risen, but its messenger, the dawn, had made the eastern horizon blush. Along with the fragrance of the mist, the bird songs hesitantly made their presence felt. Through the mouth of the cave, the mist entered, mixed with amber light. Dattatreya, or Datta, the son of sage Atri, was in retreat in this mountain cave. Nature's emissaries helped him to come out of his heart's cave. His mind and body responded in kind to the freshness of the morning and the milieu of the mountain. He came out and was greeted by bountiful nature. As the sun rose slowly, the mist cleared, and his eyes fell on a hamlet at the foot of the cliff. The sight evoked the need for food. Smiling at himself, he descended the mountain and entered the village. Being a wandering mendicant, he approached a hut and said, "Bhavati bhikshan dehi," according to the prevalent custom. A teenaged maiden came out and said that her parents were out in the field and requested the monk to wait for a short while she husked and cleaned the rice. Dattatreya, also called as Avadhuta, or a person who has shaken off all worldliness, waited. He could hear the sound of the bangles as the girl did the husking and cleaning, but discovered that the sound went on reducing till everything became silent. In a little while, the girl came out and poured the grain into his begging bowl. After accepting the alms, he asked the girl, "Child, how is it that the initial sound of the bangles went on reducing till everything became silent?" The girl replied bashfully, "When I started husking, there was so much noise made by the bangles that I felt it would disturb your meditative mood. So I went on removing the bangles one by one until only one bangle remained on each wrist. Even these two touched each other sometimes, causing the noise. Finally, only one bangle remained on one wrist, and after that, everything became quiet." It is said that Dattatreya realized and acknowledged the great spiritual truth she had given him through her action. He exclaimed, "Vase bahunam kalaho bhavet varta dvayorapi eka eva charet tasmat kumarya iva kankanaha." Where many dwell, there is noise and quarrel. Even when there are only two, there is a dialogue. That is why one must live in solitude to enjoy being alone, like the bangle on a wrist of the maiden. This verse has different meaning and significance according to the level one is in. This is the case with every truth, as it is understood from different levels. Dattatreya had 24 gurus from whom he learned different aspects of spirituality. Out of them, only a few were human beings like the maiden. The rest of them were either elements like the earth, air, water, ether, or the natural forces like the sun, moon, or the living creatures like birds, insects, and animals. This shatters the popular belief that it is necessary to have a master in human form. It is recommended and even expedient, but not mandatory. The story mentioned above illustrates a few of the basic requirements of a seeker: sensitivity, an open mind, and receptivity. But for these qualities, he would not have even noticed the lessons those 24 gurus had to offer him. In this sense, almost each and every situation or a transaction has something to teach us. But how many of us learn? Learning demands some basic eligibility from the learner, which brings us to the concept of adhikara. Adhikara is the eligibility to learn anything. A person not having any background of either mathematics or physics or aerodynamics cannot possibly understand the science of rocketry. Or without the background or taste for and recognition of form and color, one cannot learn painting or sculpture. The sages observed that a person aspiring to enter spiritual life had to necessarily have certain basic requirements. This they called as the adhikara. They were convinced that the wisdom they had to offer could not fructify in an unprepared field. In our country, adhikara has been one of the most misunderstood and misused concepts. As human beings, we are gifted with a special talent. When we are unable to rise to the level of an ideal, we bring the ideal down. When there was an overall fall in the value system, Brahmins or the priest class became the custodians of Vedic literature because they had preserved it from mouth to ear for thousands of years. At the same time, they acted as cobras guarding the hidden treasures. The treasure is neither useful to the cobra nor can be used by others. They transferred the word only to the sons born in the priestly class. Somehow they misinterpreted that only the Brahmins were eligible. Unfortunately, the Brahmins served only as the tape recorders, hardly comprehending the essence of the Vedas, as they did not try to live the truth therein. They exploited the common men through their recitation skills and fanned the fire of fear and greed by talking about the rituals and the benefits to those who followed them, or the punishment for those who had failed. Consequently, the scriptures did not serve the purpose they were meant to. There was another type of priestly class, characterized by its love for hair-splitting argument and dry scholarship. These pundits interpreted the scriptures, commented on them, and complicated the whole literature, making it too terse and difficult for an earnest seeker. Because the seeker had to necessarily know the scriptural jargon to understand the essence of the Upanishads. However, these two types of priesthood did help in maintaining the physical, or rather the sonic form of the scriptures. But for the tradition of seekers and sannyasis or mendicants, which continued despite of either the social fall or the onslaught of foreign invasions that left our country slavish, the wisdom would be lost to us in its purest form. And the wisdom thus preserved did trickle into the society whenever there was an interaction between the seekers and the sannyasis. Being far-sighted, the rishis of the Upanishads were prepared for such problems. They were very much aware that the crests and troughs are inevitable to existence, and that not all human beings are expected to be prepared for the life divine. They knew that most of the persons were and would be metaphysically sleeping and would not be able to comprehend and use the truths they were freely distributing, and that in their sleepy blindness the human beings would hurt themselves. From their lofty states, they could not possibly have anything but compassion and love for the suffering humanity. So they developed an ingenious way to introduce the eligibility norms besides the main body of the Upanishads. They included very significant and meaningful verses which they called as the Shanti mantras. Traditionally, the Shanti mantras are to be chanted before and after the study of the Upanishads. It is not that there is a different Shanti mantra for each Upanishad, but depending on the source Samhita or the branch thereof, there are a few common Shanti mantras. The beauty of these Shanti mantras is that they directly or indirectly hint at the goal of life and the necessary eligibility of the seeker, like this attitude a seeker should have, the state of mind, of senses and body, and other vital things. In a supermarket, a couple with their 8-year-old son were in the toy section selecting a toy for the child. A puzzle attracted the attention of the wife. She spent nearly 10 minutes trying to solve it but failed. The husband, who was a professor in mathematics, got interested in the toy. Though he failed repeatedly, he took it up as a challenge and spent nearly an hour on it. Disgusted, they called the salesman and asked him the utility of the toy for their 8-year-old son if even they, as adults, fail to solve it. The salesman smilingly observed that the toy was insolvable. It was only to make children get used to the complicated life which too is insolvable. No matter what we do, or whatever the intensity of our effort, we never have any sense of fulfillment. We keep desiring and keep working to fulfill these desires. As soon as a desire gets accomplished, there is no time to enjoy the fulfillment. Instead, a new desire takes its place. Our dreams and desires keep changing. The condition is not different at the intellectual or ego levels. We have thirst to know something. When it is known, instead of satisfaction, there is a strange disappointment that no matter how hard one tries, something always remains unknown. One is hungry for power, and if the power is achieved, one discovers how powerless one is in life. For the death can and does snatch everything off without any prior intimation and in a moment. Perhaps that is the reason for our repeated experience that the world and life connected with it is imperfect, and we keep vainly searching for perfection outside in the world of objects. The Rishis of the Upanishads suggest that instead of searching for the perfection, we should seek the wholeness, giving this great hint through a Shanti mantra which appears in the Upanishads of the Shukla Yajurveda, like the Ishavasya Upanishad and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The Rishis declare, Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. That Brahman is whole. This, the world too, is whole. The whole, the world, has come out of the whole, that is Brahman. The Brahman remains the same, even when the whole, that is the world, comes out of the whole, Brahman. Let the peace descend on all three planes. Om. Perfection is a myth like the horizon. Horizon only appears to be the place where the sky and earth meet. Perfection is the ideal or the desirable. Consequently, it is at the level of the mind, intellect and ego. Because these faculties do not accept anything as it is. Like the quest for the horizon makes us dissatisfied of the place where we stand, the search for perfection also makes us dissatisfied with the way things are. On a careful observation, we find that the wholeness is very much there in nature, whether it is the vegetable kingdom or the animal kingdom, everything is whole. A small seed contains the whole tree with all the details, the branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits. It contains infinite seeds that can bring millions of trees into existence. An egg contains all the details of the birds along with their most beautiful, colorful feathers. Similarly, it is with the human beings. This is at the physical level, and it is so even at the psychological and behavioral levels. On observing a child, we find that its behavior is whole. There is no perfection. When it is angry, it becomes anger. When hungry, it becomes hunger. When playful, it becomes the play. When it expresses love, it becomes love. There is purity in its behavior and being. That is why we love children. But as and when they grow up, they are made to learn the ways of the society. They learn that there are the acceptable and the unacceptable behavior and emotions. The child learns that when it smiles, even when not in a mood, it is advantageous to him or her, and that he hides certain emotions considered as taboo. The people accept it. So in a way, the mind, intellect and ego start adulterating the being of the child, and it loses its innocence and purity. But the mind, intellect and ego are the necessary facets for growth, for in the child's purity there is ignorance and no wisdom. The ignorance is due to the fact that the child is not yet exposed to the ways of the world. Whenever it learns them, and such learning is inevitable, it loses the wholeness in its behavior. The learning is a part of its growth in life, and in such growth lies the formation of the concept of I, not I, leading it towards selfishness. The Upanishadic mantra above suggests a further growth from this narrow selfishness towards that self which identifies with the whole existence. With such identification, a person completes the full circle from ignorant, childish, whole behavior to the childlike whole behavior full of wisdom. The knowledge of the Vedanta has been understood by many in our country intellectually. Unless such knowledge gets digested to become wisdom, which nurtures our life in all its aspects, it will be just a topic for discussion and argument. Such discussion and argument has been going on for centuries. This has been a rather unfortunate and avoidable part of the history of our great country. In this sense, it is better not to store the knowledge intellectually, rather than wasting it on verbal discussion or argument. Having known the goal intellectually, one realizes that there are certain obstacles to proceed with the journey. The first thing that stops us from being receptive to the truth and learning is our physical as well as the psychological weakness. A Shanti mantra from the Samaveda, which is chanted before and after the main body of the Upanishads from the Veda, like Kenopanishad and Chandogyopanishad, reads: Om Apyayantu Mamangani Vak Pranaschakshush Strotramatho Balamindriyani Cha Sarvani Sarvam Brahmopanishadam Maham Brahma Nirakuryam Ma Brahma Nirakarot Anirakaranamastu Anirakaranam Me Astu Tadatmani Nirate Upanishatsu Dharmas Te Mai Santu Te Mai Santu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May my limbs become strong. Let my speech, vital airs, sight, hearing, and all other senses be vigorous. All existence is the Brahman of the Upanishads. May I never deny Brahman. May not Brahman deny me. Let there be no denial at all. Let there be no denial at least on my part. May the virtues in the Upanishads abide in me, devoted to the Atman as I am. May they abide in me. Let the peace descend on all three planes. Om. Unless the body is strong and healthy, without any disease, a lot of time and energy has to be spent only on looking after it. The bodily weakness descends on to the senses and mind. Consequently, one becomes an underachiever. This is true not only in an individual, but the entire nation, as in the case of our own country. We became weak in every sense, in spite of the great culture. Weakness, physical as well as psychological, has been the bane of our country. Swami Vivekananda rightly analyzed our national problem to be weakness, which is the outcome of more than 1,000 years of slavery. We have imbibed this weakness as well as the evils like jealousy and fear under the foreign oppression, leaving us what we are today. He goaded everyone who came to him to be physically strong first and then built up the much needed psychological strength. He proclaimed, "Let me tell you that we want strength, strength, and every time strength." And the Upanishads are the great mine of strength. Therein lies strength enough to invigorate the whole world. The whole world can be vivified, made strong, energized through them. They will call with a trumpet voice upon the weak, the miserable, and the downtrodden of all races, all creeds, and all sects to stand on their own feet and be free. Freedom, physical freedom, mental freedom, and spiritual freedom are the watchwords of the Upanishads. The Upanishads keep repeating this message of strength throughout. Mundaka Upanishad declares, "Nayam Atma balahinena labhyaha." This Atman is not available to the weak. Unfortunately, most of us are either totally unaware of this great inheritance of Vedantic wisdom or have only knowledge about it, which is more dangerous because verbal knowledge gives us a false feeling that we know it. The Shanti Mantra from the Samaveda quoted above seeks physical strength, the strength of the senses. This is followed by a prayer that the seeker be receptive to the truth that everything is Brahman as declared by the Upanishads. The seeker should not negate anything but accept everything as Brahman. Labeling or judgment is very obstinate like all habits. This habit stops us from being receptive to the truth which otherwise is ever available. The divine is always there, only we are not available to it, as we are involved with our own psychological activity of comparison, competition, labeling and judgment. How can one come out of such activity? This is given out in the Shanti Mantra from the Atharva Veda. Om Bhadram Karnebhi Shrunuyama Devaha Bhadram Pashyemakshabhiryajatraha Sthirairangaihi Stushtuvam Sastanubhihi Vyashema Devahitam Yadayuhu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. O gods, may we hear auspicious words with our ears. While engaged in auspicious action, may we see auspicious things with our eyes. While praising the Lords with steady limbs, may we enjoy a life that is beneficial to the gods. Let the peace descend on all three planes. Om. Nothing is either totally good or totally bad. Everything has its positive as well as negative aspects. If one gives importance to only either of them, then our view of the thing gets restricted and narrow. Consequently, we get cut off from the reality to that very extent of narrowness. Normally, the above mantra is interpreted to be a prayer, seeking only the auspicious objects for the senses of hearing and sight. Such interpretation may have been the cause for the bane of escapism which has been charged against our culture. If we make a careful observation, we find that the society consists of both good and evil and all other pairs of opposites. So it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get only the good and the positive side of existence. The rishis of the Upanishads were too observant to suggest the seeker to seek only the good. Here, the Shanti Mantra offers us a very practical method of overcoming this problem. It uses the word Bhadra, which is translated approximately as the auspiciousness. It also means good, and whatever is good need not be pleasant. There are two ways of learning, one through the pleasant and the other through the unpleasant or painful. It is an altogether different matter that we, in the narrowness of our vision, desire only the pleasant and avoid the unpleasant. The Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram was once asked that while the Acharya used to use the title of Jagadguru, which means the teacher of the world, he hardly came across a few hundred people whom he taught the spiritual legacy of Adi Shankaracharya. The Acharya smilingly replied, he was no doubt a Jagadguru. The questioner's understanding of the word was improper. He was not the teacher of the world, but Jagat or the world was his guru or the teacher. He continued that there are two types of teachers in the world. The first type, which constitutes most of the world, consists of such teachers who teach us what we should not do. And the second type, which is a minority, teaches us what we should do. That is how Datta, the son of sage Atri, had so many teachers, as he was always in a receptive mood. In this sense, the Shanti Mantra seeks receptivity, which happens to be a mandatory first step for learning because it helps the seeker to recognize his teachers. Eligibility of the Guru is necessary, and it was more stringent than that of a disciple. He has to be experienced in whatever he is sharing with the disciple. The Guru should be like a bridge between the mundane level in which the disciple is and the divine level which he himself is in. Mundaka Upanishad clearly mentions this. Tad vijnanartham sa gurumevabhigachet savitpanihi shrotriyam brahmanishtam. To experience the truth with devotion, he should approach the Guru, who is a master of the scriptures and established in the Brahman. Spirituality is qualitatively different from any other secular education. The latter is at the gross or at the most intellectual level and demands the teacher's proficiency in that particular field. That is, he should fulfill only the first condition in the above verse. His personal life has nothing to do with what he teaches, but the spirituality is at the deepest level, and the Guru has to be established in the reality which is being transmitted by him. Most of the time we find people well versed with the scriptures, but as far as the establishment in the reality is concerned, most of them fall short. They can, at the most, be called as teachers. It is very difficult to find a Guru, and moreover, such a person does not claim anything. It can be that he is apparently living a very ordinary life in an extraordinary way. When one is blessed by the company of such a teacher, the student and the teacher live the essence of the following Shanti Mantra, which appears in the Krishna Yajurveda. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunattu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May the truth protect us both, the teacher and the taught. May it nourish us both with its wisdom. May we both achieve great things together. Let the learning be enlightened. May we not cavil at each other. Let the peace descend on all three planes. Om. The Guru, on his part, by his very state of being, is able to assess the state of the disciple and tries to come down to the level of the disciple and to lead her or him to the higher states. And the disciple is totally open, like a womb to receive the seed of Brahman. The disciple, like a totally empty vessel, without any preconceived notion, is innocent and non-judgmental like a child. Unless one is totally empty, the reality cannot descend into him. There is a Zen anecdote in which a philosopher visits a Zen master. The master asks him to sit and calls for tea. When the tea arrives, the master starts pouring the tea into a cup and continues pouring even when the cup is filled. Consequently, the tea starts overflowing onto the floor. The philosopher, unable to restrain himself, exclaims that the tea is being wasted as the cup cannot hold any more. The Zen master smilingly says that, like the cup, the philosopher is also too full to accept what he has to offer. Many times, the Guru has to be very harsh in correcting the ways of the disciple. This harshness has in it infinite compassion of the master. It is likely that the disciple who is at a grosser level may misunderstand it as cruelty and even move away from him. This reaction on the part of the disciple is also natural. A man who is asleep despises any attempt to wake him up. The disciple who is metaphysically asleep for many lives need not take the waking acts of the master healthily. That is why the Shanti Mantra adds that the master and disciple may not cavil at each other. The master, if he is the real Guru, will never cavil at the disciple. So, this part of the mantra is exclusively for the benefit of the disciple. The process of learning mostly starts with the act of listening, which has been called as Shravana. Listening is qualitatively different from hearing. Hearing is an impression created by the sound on the sense organ, while listening is deeper, where there is comprehension or an understanding of the sound. Many of us have only the capacity to hear but not listen. This is because when the sound falls on the eardrum, so many other things are going on that we do not even register it. Listening requires more effort, as the sound has to be not only registered but also comprehended. But even in listening, the intellectual activity of comparison with the either store of knowledge, analysis and synthesis is going on. But Shravana is really an alert receptivity to the essence of the sound, and hence does not have any equivalent in English. Hence, one who has the capacity for Shravana gets enlightened immediately. However, it also means listening, as most, if not all of us, are incapable of Shravana. After listening and comprehending what has been said, one does manana or contemplation on those truths. This is to ascertain that one gets the conviction so as never to entertain any doubts in one's mind when one begins the practice. After manana, one begins nididhyasana or the profound and repeated meditation on truth, which has become the intellectual conviction. Thus, Shravana, Manana and Nididhyasana are the 3 steps recommended in the path of self-realization. There is always a great danger of stagnation after the intellectual comprehension of the Upanishadic truths. That is, one may continue to stay at the discussion and argument level, as it has been happening in the case of Pandits who are masters in hair-splitting discussions and arguments. Such persons remain as admirers of the crockery instead of eating what is in it. Then there is a greater danger that they may take the intellectual understanding to be the realization itself and never bother to either begin the real quest or even launch themselves on ego trips and teaching. To avoid such mishap, the rishis have a wonderful hint to the seekers in the following Shanti mantra appearing in the Upanishads of Rigveda. Om Vangme Manasih Pratishtita Mano Me Vachih Pratishtitam Aviravirma Edhi Vedasya Ma'anistaha Shrutam Me Ma Prahasihi Anenadhitenahhoratran Sandadhami Ritam Vadishyami Satyam Vadishyami Tanmavavatu Tadvaktaramavatu Avatu Mam Avatu Vaktaram Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May my speech be firmly held in my mind. May my mind be firmly held in my speech. O Thou who art manifestation, be manifest unto me, guarding my knowledge like a linchpin of the wheel. Do not let the truth taught to my ear fall away. By this knowledge that I learn, I shall firmly hold the days and the nights. I will utter the reality. I will utter the truth. May that nourish me. May that nourish the teacher. May that nourish the teacher. Let the peace descend on all 3 planes. Om. One of the greatest insights of our sages was that life couldn't be divided into secular and spiritual dimensions. The outer action has a direct relationship with mind and being, and the state of mind has a direct bearing on the outer actions. In the above verse, they suggest the mandatory integration of thought, word, and action. Sophistication has been a bane on human existence through introduction of the avoidable habit of hypocrisy, one of the most fundamental causes for mental conflicts. Most of the time, there is no connection between thought and word or word and action. Sophistication may be considered to be necessary in the society, for there is a fear of anarchy setting in. But it does not have any place whatsoever in a seeker's life. He can never afford to divide his time meant for spiritual practice and for his secular needs. His life is like his counterparts who are yet to start the quest, is interconnected with each and every act. If he spends an hour on his meditation seat, he has to ensure that the remaining 23 hours are in tune with that 1 hour meditation. With the improvement in the quality of meditation, the quality of his life during the rest of the day has to improve, and vice versa. The truths received from the Upanishads must necessarily percolate into the so-called mundane life. In this sense, the ordinary life gets spiritualized. In the above verse, the seeker prays for the integration of thought, word and action. Speech is included in all actions. When this happens, the glimpse of reality starts manifesting in the life, and with it, the verbal knowledge gets transformed into wisdom, for the essence contained by the words is digested, nourishing the being. To such a person, there is nothing like day characterized by conscious action and night which is governed by the unconscious. In a way, the unconscious starts transforming into the conscious through the constant awareness. All the Shanti mantras conclude with the repetition of the word Shanti, which means peace, thrice. The rishis had diagnosed our problem to be disturbance at the three levels: physical, natural and internal. The chanting of the word Shanti thrice signifies the removal of the disturbance at all these three levels. The disturbance at the physical level is pain, sickness and fatigue. These distract the seeker from putting his everything for the search. Mental restlessness, lethargy, turmoil, depression and other upheavals form the constituents of the internal disturbance. The natural disturbance is created by nature, like the earthquake, floods, etc., over which one does not have any control. The chanting of Shanti thrice with total feeling and awareness can definitely create a confidence in the seeker to face the disturbance. The basic treatment of the Upanishad is to tackle all problems at the subjective level. Fundamentally, therefore, the chanting of Shanti mantras was to create a mood of receptivity and acceptance in the seeker and to ensure his total commitment to learning. This is very obvious from our day-to-day experience. A player does not even take note of his injury during the play, or a thinker and an artist does not feel the discomfort during their engagement. Added to these Shanti mantras, there were specific instructions to the seeker as to how to approach the treasure of understanding that lies strewn all over in this grand literature. Prashnopanishad, as the very name indicates, is a series of questions asked by the seekers and their answers given by sage Pippalada. All the 6 seekers have a noble lineage and belong to a tradition of seeking. At the very outset, when they approach the master in reverence, the Upanishad says, Tanhasa Rashiruvacha Bhuya eva tapasa brahmacharyena Shraddhaya samvatsaram samvatsatah yatha kamam prashnan prachata yadi vidnyasyamaha sarvam havo vakshama iti. To them Rishi said, live here again for an year in a fitting manner with tapas, austerity, brahmacharya, self-control, and shraddha, faith. Then you can put questions as you please. If we know, we shall explain all your questions. Paradoxically, in spite of the Upanishad mentioning the very high caliber of the seekers, the sage suggests that they undertake austerity, self-control, and faith for a year. It has a great significance. Because of the high caliber of the seekers, the Rishi asks them to undertake the practice for only an year. If the seekers were unprepared, it would have been much longer, or in fact, he would have never said that he would answer the questions. Because of their noble lineage of seeking, he wanted them to obliterate the memories of their inherited knowledge. Knowledge is always borrowed and is never a part of one's experience. The three practices, tapas, brahmacharya and shraddha, are most powerful modes to achieve receptivity, so necessary for entering into the inner shrine of reality. In his commentary on Taittiriya Upanishad, Shankaracharya explains the meaning of tapaha. Taccha tapo bahyantakarana samadhanam tadvarakatvat brahma pratipatte manasaschendriyanam cha hya ekagram paramam tapaha tajjayah sarva dharmebhyah sadharma paro uchyate Mahabharatam Shanti Parva iti smrite. This tapaha consists of quietening the outer and inner instruments, for that forms the door to the wisdom of Brahman. The concentration of mind and the senses is the highest tapaha, since it is higher than all dharmas. It is called the highest dharma. Mahabharata Shanti Parva says the Smriti. For quietening the outer and inner instruments, Shankaracharya uses the word samadhanam, and again quotes from Mahabharata, which uses the word ekagram. The word samadhanam means the settled or quietened state of poise, which obviously means that all we have to do is to allow the senses and mind to settle down, very much like allowing the disturbed water in a pond, which has a lot of dust, to settle down. Normally, we are not even aware of the disturbance, but its effect is seen through our restlessness and inability to concentrate. So the common man has to begin with the concentration of mind as implied by the quotation from Mahabharata, which is meant for the common man. Once a person is able to concentrate, she or he realizes that the more one tries to quieten the mind, the more disturbed it gets, like the water in the pond. With this understanding of tapa, we are able to at least mentally comprehend the first practice suggested by the sage. Brahmacharya has normally been translated as celibacy or abstention from sexual indulgence. Sexual force no doubt dominates this whole existence and is responsible for all creativity. But if it becomes an indulgence, then a lot of energy is wasted. So, even with the limited understanding of Brahmacharya, the seeker stands to gain. But there is also a great danger of suppression, which can bring about abnormalities like temper tantrums, gluttony, depression, and other avoidable limitations. Moreover, the seekers approaching the sage Pippalada are claimed to be Brahmapara, or those devoted to Brahman, and Brahmanishta, or those engaged in realizing the Brahman. They were already aware of the lower meaning of Brahmacharya and perhaps under total self-control. A more general understanding is necessary. It means abstention from any type of involvement or indulgence at the levels of body, senses, mind, and ego. The seeker has to put the total energy at his command, as he is seeking the whole and not the part. Shraddha is faith at the level of mind, belief at the level of intellect, and trust at the level of his being. Again, it means total receptivity at all levels of body, senses, mind, intellect, and ego. Generally, A mind filled with prior knowledge has comparison, competition, and doubts which do not allow the seeker to be receptive. This does not in any way mean that questions, doubts, and discussions were unwelcome. On the contrary, any type of doubts were even encouraged. The rishis were of the conviction that unless one was open-minded to the newer views of reality, which is beyond mind and intellect, responsible for discussion, doubt, and analysis, there was this danger of getting stuck to the levels of mind and ego. Sage Pippalada uses the plural we when he says, "If we know, we shall explain all your questions." This is because he has identified with the infinite and does not claim the wisdom to be his, as I, you, he limit the mind. The study of Upanishads can become a journey into the unknown and even unknowable because it's going beyond all familiar instruments like the body, senses, mind, intellect, and ego. While venturing on such a quest, all that is required of the seeker is to have totally open mind and a spirit of adventure. The spirit of adventure for a seeker has to be necessarily greater than a mountaineer or a polar explorer for whom help is available in the form of equipment and maps. And for the seeker, everything and every moment is new. The sense of achievement on identifying with the whole, the infinite and the eternal, however, transcends all words and is worth all the effort.